So, Richard, thanks so much for coming this morning. It's great to have you here as our guest and to do an interview about classical improvisation. It's an amazing subject, and most of us don't know that much about it. Can you say a little bit about how you got started in improvising?
Um, yeah, when I was a kid, we had a piano at home, and my father used to play popular music on the piano. Wrote a number of songs that aren't known, but they were very musical, and I kind of inherited his ability to play by ear. In fact, I'd often shoo him off the piano, which got my mother very angry because I wanted to play. And so I was playing by ear when I was quite young, and I enjoyed playing things that I heard on the radio or little nursery rhyme songs that I knew. And that was all what people call playing by ear. And I think maybe when I was a teenager, I started somehow branching out and creating things that were, you might call, my own material based on that, rather than playing tunes by ear that I had heard. And somehow that transition from playing by ear to improvising was what brought me into my adult life as an improviser. And it's something that every jazz musician has to be able to do, but very few classical players are so inclined or have been taught to do that kind of thing.
I remember I've read so often that during the classical and Baroque periods that the musicians of the time were very adept at improvisation. In fact, there are some famous evenings and contests that involve people like Mozart and Beethoven. Bach, of course, was asked to improvise music that became the musical offering when he visited Frederick the Great towards the end of his life.
Right. It is fortunate that he wrote that down and that we have records of some of those things, but one can only imagine the great music that these great musicians were able to improvise. And that's primarily the keyboard players, harpsichordists and organists, but also the instrumentalists were expected to make variations on whatever melodies they were playing at the time. Certainly in the Renaissance and Baroque period, and perhaps into the early Romantic period, but it's primarily an art for keyboard players. And any keyboard player who was going to play a continual part during the Baroque period was expected to make variations and realize from the very sketchy bass line and numbers that were given to him. So this was an absolutely essential part of keyboard players' training.
Some of today's players grow up and they play rock music and popular music, and improvisation can be a big part of those experiences. Personally, I just began on classical guitar, and it was almost a traumatic experience to consider playing a note that wasn't actually written. So I know that you have taught improvisation to many people in many parts of the world. And can you give us a little bit of a sense of how you approach teaching improvisation, and maybe with a demonstration of how you'd approach the first exercises?
Sure. Well, I was doing it for a long time before I was given the opportunity to teach it. And when I started teaching it, I had to think about what it was that I could start students on to experience the spontaneity of improvisation without making it such a rigid thing that it would be snuffed out in the process. So I think my approach is essentially a harmonic one. And in that sense, it can be compared with the way jazz musicians learn. They all learn all of the chords. They have to know what a major seventh is, what a minor triad with an added sixth is. They know the constituency of all these chords, and when they improvise, they are essentially improvising around the chord with various filler notes. So it too is harmonically based, and so I essentially said that we are introduce it on the basis of simple harmonies. So if you have a C major chord, if you play a melody that consists only of the notes of the C major chord, and just think about shape, which has to do with the direction of the melody and the meter that you're in. So for instance, if you're in 3 beats per measure, if you set up a simple accompaniment on C major, and then freely shape a melody above it using only those notes, that's a simple 8-measure phrase. I didn't have to think about it in advance. Almost no beginning pianist would have to think about it because the notes are so readily available. And instead of having to figure out how to make it work, you can just allow your fingers to move to the notes that are available. And interestingly enough, that impetus is what comes from the inside. That's the beginning of inspiration and brings it beyond a mechanical exercise and relates it to the spur of the moment feeling. So essentially, that's the basis. And then you add the next chord, which would be the dominant or the dominant 7, giving you either 3 or 4 notes and going back and forth between the two in an 8-measure phrase, for instance. Happens to have a shape to it. It makes sense. It may not be a brilliant, inspired melody, but it was created without a great deal of effort, and it was just an idea that came at the spur of the moment. So this is the basis of the way I teach improvisation, and gradually one adds more complicated chords, different keys, decorating notes, and pretty soon, I should say, you have beginnings of real music making.
So in the sample that you just played, all of the melody notes were notes of the 2 triads, of the tonic and the dominant.
Exactly right, and that is the key. If you're only playing a melody, what harmony do you use? If you have to find the harmony, if you're sophisticated, you can do it. But if not, you don't really know which notes of the harmony, which chords to use with the melody that you play, even if it's a very simple melody. So this turns it around and says that the melody comes only from the harmony, and that way the two are together and you don't have the very difficult challenge and of trying to find what many possible harmonies will fit with a single melody. So the melody always comes from the harmony.
So in that sense, I know that when you do an improvisation concert, you ask for melodies from the audience that then you have to actually think of the the pitch content and the key, of course, of the melody, and then find the harmonies there.
Right, and since that's the reverse process and it's so much more difficult, most people won't do that kind of thing. And you don't have to. When you're improvising, you're doing it for the pleasure of it, and just to find out that after all these years of studying piano from music, that you actually have a lot of music inside you if you're shown how to tap it. So that is really my goal, to let people who haven't experienced that delight of improvisation, to find out there are ways to do it. And that's a long way of saying, yes, if you just start with a melody, that's a much more challenging kind of thing. And just as a single melody note can be set by so many different chords, you really have to have a knowledge of all the possibilities and of the various styles to do that on the spot as an improviser. But that's really not my goal with most of the students I work with.
Mm-hmm. So you had shared with me a few weeks ago this book that you've written that is a progressive study of introducing improvisation for the keyboard. And it goes through a series of steps of introducing the tonic chord, the dominant seventh chord, in various meters, various keys, phrase structures, and all kinds of elaborations from that. It's something that I find fascinating, even though I'm not, as you know, a keyboard player. But I will be sure that we post a link to that for anyone who is listening to this who wishes to get started and to explore that. And so that will be accessible to everyone. Now, so one of the, I think in the next week or so, the next Star Wars movie is coming out. It's good timing for our meeting today. And so I'm wondering if we could take a look at the Star Wars theme and have you play the theme and discuss a little bit about the theme, and then perhaps do some samples of improvisation in various periods, whether it's Renaissance or Baroque or classical or Romantic or 20th century, your call, and just to take us on a brief tour of the potentials of the theme.
Okay, well, I don't know if I'll be able to do all of the potentials, because there's a lot of potential in this theme, and certainly John Williams is an amazing composer. Everything is very sophisticated, even this seemingly simple theme. And I'll play just the melody. Here I have maybe several measures of it in front of me. And that's the essence of the theme, and what most people would expect you to use if you're going to be using that theme. Already it's nice rhythmically. It starts on the fourth beat, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the next triplet is on the first beat, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So just the starting on the pickup, 4, leads you to expect it's going to be like that, and every other time it is different. So it's quite sophisticated, just from a melodic and rhythmic point of view. That's irrespective of whatever harmonies are being used to accompany it. So I got to say, generally, if I'm given a theme like that, and over the years I have been a few times, I don't always use that pickup note, but maybe I can do that now. Let's take a little kind of chronological tour, and I'll talk a little bit about the styles. If somebody were to say, I'd like it in a Renaissance style, that implies rather basic harmonies. You do not want anything that's too sophisticated. Otherwise, it's going to sound Baroque or perhaps later than that. So if you use just basic harmonies, just continue that little phrase into something that was like a Renaissance dance. So as I'm thinking about it, I'm thinking about Renaissance dance and the kind of rhythm and harmony that would be appropriate for that style. My goal is to make music out of each of these improvisations and not make it just a demonstration. If it's a demonstration, it hasn't achieved what I would hope to achieve, and that is that there's a certain amount of surprise that and by the change of context, what is expected to be one thing becomes transformed into something else. So that would be what I would think of as a Renaissance dance style. If we were to go into the next period, Baroque period, well, a couple of things occur to me. If it were part of a kind of keyboard suite, so that's a kind of harpsichord texture. And if it were to be more contrapuntal, like a fugue, you'd have to think about it. It would be answered by a voice, and then, so it could be in a fugal style. Etc. So you have a three-part texture, and that could probably be continued for a while. You bring it into other closely related keys and possibly the minor. So that would be more of a contrapuntal texture. Should I do that again, or is that okay?
That was great. And then, so is there a romantic or
yes? Well, for instance, the typical classical texture would be the Alberti bass. Ending on a half cadence there, and of course it would continue on. That would be more of a Mozart and Haydn style. If it were to be Beethoven, well, somehow the minor mode comes to mind in a little thicker left-hand texture. point, he probably wouldn't end on a Picardy third like that, but nonetheless, most of it was with that style in mind. And as soon as you get into the Romantic period, early 19th century, for instance, Chopin, you would have a much wider spaced accompaniment. Let's change the key somehow. G major is getting a little tiresome, so I'm thinking of Chopin. So I would like to have the kind of figuration that he might have, and of course he was a genius in harmony and melody, and one just does the best one can. Etc. And if I were to think about Brahms, well, again, the minor mode comes. So somehow I'm thinking about his Hungarian dances, I suppose. Okay, a little excerpt there. And maybe we should push into the 20th century. Although, let's consider late 19th century with a kind of impressionistic style like Debussy. What does one do with that? And when I think of Debussy, think of whole tone scales, you think of ninth chords, perhaps moving parallelly. If we bring it into the 20th century, well, of course, there are so many different 20th century styles. Perhaps the pandiatonic style of Stravinsky in his neoclassical period. What does pandiatonic mean? Well, here's a diatonic scale. if you use those notes without reference to the tonality, which is implicit, but rather as kind of sonorities available from the notes of the scale, and you think of dissonant clusters, those are all notes of the G major scale. So if you emphasize that in a harmonic accompaniment, you might have something like this. And if you're thinking about Bartok, the thing that comes to mind for me is the use of modes. And Bartok loved the augmented fourth, so if you use the augmented fourth in the major mode, that gives you the Lydian mode, and if you play the melody using that augmented fourth, then you get a very Bartokian melody. Okay, that took advantage of the augmented fourth, and I think that kind of is what we should consider, unless we want to go into an atonal style, and that one would associate that with Schoenberg and his followers. Schoenberg did it best, I think. Now, this is a very tonal melody. So what would one do? Well, one really shouldn't do it. I don't think it's going to lend itself, but if I absolutely had to, I would use the shape so that I would choose different notes that were not tonal.
So let's then next look at one of the most iconic pieces for classical guitarists everywhere, and that is Fernando Sor's Variations on the Theme of Mozart. It came from the Magic Flute. The aria is called Das Klinget so Herrlich, and it was originally composed for plucked strings, glockenspiel, and male chorus. And today we're going to look at a piano reduction that has the orchestral parts plus the vocal parts, and maybe we can explore the nature of this theme, and perhaps if Mozart had treated it in various styles, or later composers were looking at this theme, perhaps we can look at some possibilities that it offers. So
Let me play the basic theme with its introduction, and that'll be, I think, a good start. This is the introduction, now the sung part. It's very catchy, and it actually, even though it sounds so simple, it's very sophisticated, as is everything Mozart wrote, no matter how simple it sounded. And if I were to use this as a teaching tool, I would concentrate on the harmonic progression, because it is a basic and very useful harmonic progression. We're in the key of G major, that's the tonic, 1, 5, 5, 1, 1, 2, 6, very close to the 4 chord, but a nice substitution for it, 1, 6, 4, 5, 1. So we have 1, 2, 3 basic chords, and I would use those chords to improvise on, just as we said at the beginning, where most of the notes would come from the chords that are being played in the accompaniment. I think it would be easiest to start with Mozart's own style, because the simple accompaniment, simple harmony lends itself to that kind of thing. So if I were to do that, I would think there's a little 8-measure phrase that is very much within a Mozart style. And if I were to expand that a bit, perhaps more of a romantic accompaniment. Outside of the boundaries of that chord progression, but that's what I would do if I were really improvising on it. Take the basis of what is there and then bring it to something new within the style that I was thinking about. Any other suggestions for what to do with this?
yes, I'm wondering if you were going to treat it in the minor mode. Is that something that would be possible?
Yes, I would think so.
Either in the style of Mozart or Romantic or Beethoven or whatever.
Well, let's see what that would sound like if we just played it as it was originally, but with the chords changed for minor. That's at least half the phrase, 8 measures long, and seems to work fine. I'm sure Mozart would do something special with it that I wouldn't even be able to imagine, but for now, and since he's not here, yes, I would like to bring it into more of a 19th century style, and I will be thinking about Brahms and try to find an accompaniment that he might use, kind of thick. Something like that, and if I were to then use this melody, so I was kind of impelled to do things that I associate with the Brahmsian style in terms of harmony, melody, and accompaniment.
So I was curious if by any chance this melody or some transformation of it could be adapted to a sense of the style of Prokofiev.
Well, perhaps. What comes to mind is Peter and the Wolf, which is a very diatonic melody as well. Not it has more of a content using larger intervals. This one uses smaller intervals. Well, let's give it a try. Okay, if that had anything like a Prokofiev style, it was the sudden changes of harmony to chords that were not closely related.
So again, thank you, Richard, for coming here today and sharing.
Jeff,
your
thank
art.
you. It's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate the invitation.